In today's chilling story, we'll dive into the haunting tale of Richard Ramirez, the notorious serial killer known as the Night Stalker. His reign of terror across Southern California in the 1980s remains one of the most infamous crime sprees in American history. From his shocking methods to his eerie presence, the Night Stalker left the community in constant fear. Join us as we unravel the true crime behind Richard Ramirez, examining the evidence, the investigation, and the lasting impact of his crimes. Richard Ramirez was born on February 29, 1960, in El Paso, Texas. Growing up in a troubled and tumultuous environment, his early life would set the stage for the terrifying acts that would follow. Ramirez's father, Julian, was a strict man with a volatile temper, while his mother, Mercedes, struggled with her own challenges. The family was poor, and the home life was filled with tension and dysfunction. From a young age, Ramirez experienced traumatic events. He suffered a head injury at the age of 2 when he was hit in the head by a car door, which led to seizures and behavioral changes that some believe had a lasting impact on him. By the time Richard was a teenager, his behavior began to escalate. He became involved in petty theft and drug use, often roaming the streets of El Paso. It was also during these formative years that he began to develop an obsession with the darker side of human nature. As a teenager, Ramirez's fascination with the occult and Satanism grew. He was heavily influenced by his older cousin, Miguel, a Vietnam War veteran. Miguel introduced Richard to disturbing topics, including graphic war photographs and conversations about murder. Richard's early exposure to violence and his growing interest in satanic beliefs would become pivotal in shaping his later actions. In 1984, Richard Ramirez moved to Los Angeles, where his life took a dark turn. His criminal activities escalated, leading to his first known violent attack. The pattern was disturbingly similar to the crimes he would commit later, breaking into homes, attacking victims, and often leaving them with no recollection of the crime. His attacks were often indiscriminate, targeting both men and women, young and old, without regard for race or social standing. Ramirez's early victims were often subjected to brutal assaults, and his methods grew increasingly erratic. While some were left alive, others were not so fortunate. However, it was in 1985 that his reign of terror truly took off. Between 1984 and 1985, Ramirez went on a killing spree across Southern California, particularly in Los Angeles and San Francisco. The crimes were similar in nature. The killer would break into homes at night, often while the victims were asleep. He would then assault and rob them, leaving behind evidence of his crimes. What made his attacks so chilling was his apparent randomness, as there was no consistent pattern to his targets. Authorities were baffled as Ramirez showed no mercy, and his actions were unpredictable. He would often steal items from his victims, including valuables like jewelry, credit cards, and cars. He also used a variety of weapons, including a firearm, knives, and blunt objects. One of the most terrifying aspects of his crimes was his willingness to terrorize his victims before killing them, leaving them with lasting trauma. Richard Ramirez's crimes were not limited to murder. They were marked by fear, psychological torment, and lasting trauma. Ramirez's modus operandi showed an unsettling disregard for human life, and his victims came from all walks of life. There were instances where he would shoot, beat, or sexually assault his victims before fleeing the scene. His crimes spanned several months and included a combination of violent assaults, robberies, and murders. Some of his most well-known victims included couples in their homes, whom Ramirez attacked in the middle of the night. The randomness of his crimes left the community in a constant state of fear. There was no specific demographic targeted. His victims ranged from children to the elderly, and the attacks appeared to have no clear motive other than terrorizing those he encountered. The trauma Ramirez inflicted was not just physical, but psychological. His reputation for brutality was quickly cemented as police were unable to predict his next move. The psychological toll on the survivors was immense, with many left forever altered by their experiences. As Richard Ramirez's crime spree continued, the police were under increasing pressure to catch the elusive killer. A task force was formed, and efforts to catch Ramirez intensified. Yet, despite their best efforts, the killer remained undetected for months. The case took a significant turn when witnesses who had survived his attacks began to provide descriptions. Slowly, a profile of the suspect began to form. A man who was tall, thin, and had a distinctive look, long, dark hair, dark clothes, and a strange aura about him. One of the most unnerving aspects of Ramirez's crimes was his ability to blend in. He didn't follow the typical patterns of a serial killer and showed no particular preference for certain areas or types of victims. It wasn't until 1985, after Ramirez's crimes had escalated, that the authorities began to close in. A composite sketch of the suspect was released to the public, but it wasn't until a major break occurred. Ramirez was seen driving a stolen vehicle by local law enforcement. On August 31, 1985, after a widespread manhunt, he was finally apprehended in the small town of East LA. His capture brought an end to the terror, but it also started a legal process that would reveal the full scope of his crimes. The trial of Richard Ramirez began in 1988 and was a highly publicized event. During the trial, Ramirez was represented by several defense attorneys, but his actions in the courtroom were as disturbing as the crimes he committed. Ramirez was known for his erratic behavior, often smirking or making satanic gestures during the proceedings. At one point, he even raised his hand in a symbol of Satanism, which further solidified his status as a figure of evil in the eyes of the public. The prosecution painted Ramirez as a cold-blooded killer with no remorse. The evidence presented was overwhelming. Testimony from survivors, forensic evidence linking him to the crime scenes, and his own confessions. The prosecution made it clear that Ramirez was not just a serial killer, but a man who had wreaked havoc on the lives of countless people. In 1989, Richard Ramirez was convicted of 13 murders, 5 attempted murders, 11 sexual assaults, and 14 burglaries. He was sentenced to death. Ramirez's conviction was seen as a long-awaited victory for the victims and their families, though it came after years of uncertainty and fear. Richard Ramirez's legacy, though marked by his conviction, remains one of the most haunting in modern criminal history. Despite his heinous crimes, Ramirez received attention from some who were fascinated by him, including those who wrote letters to him while he was on death row. His case remains a source of study for criminologists and those seeking to understand the psychology of serial killers. Richard Ramirez spent 23 years on death row at San Quentin State Prison before dying from complications related to cancer in 2013. Though his death ended the saga of the Night Stalker, the psychological impact of his crimes continues to affect the survivors and the families of his victims. Many still carry the scars of their encounters with one of the most infamous killers in history. The story of Richard Ramirez serves as a chilling reminder of the unpredictability of evil and the resilience of those who survived the horrors he inflicted. It is a tale that continues to fascinate, frighten, and disturb, one that remains a stark reflection of the darkness that can exist within a person. Richard Ramirez's crime spree terrorized Southern California and left a permanent mark on the community. His capture and conviction brought some measure of justice, but the psychological scars remain for the survivors and victims' families. The Night Stalker case continues to captivate and horrify, serving as a grim reminder of the capacity for darkness in the world. Thank you for joining us today on The Hidden Truth, true crime story, as we explored the haunting case of Richard Ramirez. We hope this story has provided insight into the investigation, the impact on the victims, and the enduring legacy of one of America's most notorious serial killers. Stay tuned for more chilling tales in our next episode.